Mr. President, as I did 2 weeks ago, and as I'll continue to do until he is confirmed, I rise to support the nomination of Neil Gorsuch to serve on the Supreme Court. Judge Gorsuch is an accomplished mainstream jurist, and I look forward to helping make sure that he receives an up or down vote here on the Senate floor. Now, next week, my colleagues and I on the Judiciary Committee will hold confirmation hearings on Judge Gorsuch. I look forward to hearing his testimony. I'm confident that he'll impress the country with his knowledge of and respect for the law, just as he has impressed me and my colleagues. But before the hearings get underway, I thought I'd use this opportunity today to highlight an additional aspect of his life and his jurisprudence that make him an ideal nominee to serve on the High Court. So far, I've spoken on the floor about his fitness to fill Justice Scalia's seat, as well as his defense of the separation of powers and his support for religious liberty. Today, I'd like to discuss a more personal aspect of Judge Gorsuch's background, the fact that he is a Westerner. Now, as an Arizonan, I cannot overstate how important it will be to have a fellow Westerner serving on the Supreme Court. Where you're from influences your understanding of and regional sensitivities. When you look at the current makeup of the Supreme Court, there is an unmistakable lack of geographic diversity. Of the 8 current justices, 5 of them were born in New York or New Jersey, and that number stood at 6 before Judge Scalia's passing. Now, granted, Justice Kennedy is from Northern California, but to be frank, much of Northern California is about as culturally Western as Justice Breyer's hometown of Boston. The Supreme Court is in desperate need of a Western perspective. Judge Gorsuch fits that bill. When I had the opportunity to meet Judge Gorsuch in my office last month, we discussed our respective Western backgrounds. I talked to him about my days of growing up on a ranch in northern Arizona. He told me that his heart has always been in the American West. You can learn a lot about a person by how they spend their time with their friends and their family. And there's no mistaking that this aspect with Judge Gorsuch. He is a Westerner through and through. He told me about his home outside of Boulder, where his daughters raise and show chickens and goats. I was pleased to learn that each year he takes his law clerks to the National Western Stock Show in Denver, one of the nation's largest rodeos. And by now, I think we've all seen the picture of him fly fishing with Judge Scalia. While all of this demonstrates how much he has embraced the Western lifestyle, what makes Judge Gorsuch a true Westerner is more than just where he lives or where his personal interests are. Judge Gorsuch's Western values are evident in his jurisprudence, which reflects a strong commitment to public service. Arizona has had its share of distinguished public servants. In fact, it was from this very desk that the late Barry Goldwater, one of Arizona's favorite sons, steered the public policy debate for years after he chose to leave a successful career in the private sector. Judge Gorsuch's career reflects the same ethos. Early on, a young Neil Gorsuch rocketed to the top of the legal profession, becoming a partner in one of Washington's most elite law firms. But instead of enjoying the comforts of a lucrative private sector career, he left it all behind for a high responsibility, low profile job at the Department of Justice. After his time at DOJ, Neil Gorsuch could have easily retired or returned to a white shoe legal practice. Instead, he returned to his home state of Colorado to serve as a judge on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 10th Circuit. Throughout his tenure on the federal bench, Judge Gorsuch's Western disposition has shown through in his jurisprudence. I've already spoken of his skepticism toward the administrative state. With its executive bureaucracies, he cautions, quote, "They swallow huge amounts of core judicial and legislative power and concentrate federal power in a way that seems more than a little difficult to square with the Constitution of the framers' design." He shares a healthy skepticism over an overly intrusive and heavy-handed federal bureaucracy with millions of his federal Westerners. Judge Gorsuch recognizes how federal regulations interfere with the ability of Western states to govern themselves, whether it's the former administration's Clean Power Plan, its ozone rules, or even management of the Mexican gray wolf. In numerous opinions, Judge Gorsuch has given voice to many of the frustrations experienced by his Western neighbors. From his criticism of the overly assertive D.C. court, he often feels compelled to intervene from 2,000 miles away, to his recognition of the excessive litigation that arises from the complexities of split estate property rights out west. He speaks our language. These are perspectives any Westerner is familiar with, but they may not be obvious to others, including folks from New York and New Jersey. Now, if confirmed, Judge Gorsuch would already bring generational and religious diversity to the court. And perhaps more than anything, it will be his Western perspective that most enriches the debate in the years to come. As I've said before, Judge Gorsuch deserves fair consideration by those who serve in this body, and he deserves an up or down vote here on the Senate floor. He should be confirmed overwhelmingly, and I'm confident that he will be. Joining us on the floor